Sure. Why don't we get started? I think by now you know that my name is Alan Pfeffer from Sentinel Benefits. We really appreciate you joining today. You're joining the cybersecurity webinar. We think it's going to be a great program, an informative program for you today. And again, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to be with us today. I'll be moderating, so I'll be posing some questions to our panel. We have a really solid panel comprised of folks from Nixon, Peabody, and some of my colleagues at Sentinel. Please use the Q&A function that you have on Zoom to pose questions to us. The webinar is being recorded today, and everyone that's in attendance will receive a recording of the session via email. What I'd like to do now is I'd like to introduce our panelists. Joining from Nixon Peabody, a really dear friend, old friend of mine and colleague, Eric Paley, who is the Employee Benefits and Exec Compensation team leader at Nixon Peabody. Eric is advising clients on how to comply with laws governing employee benefit programs. Also from Nixon Peabody, Jenny Holmes. Jenny is Associate Deputy Leader of Cybersecurity and Privacy at Nixon Peabody. Jenny advises clients on the ever-changing legal landscape of data privacy and cybersecurity law, taking an active role in the development and management of the firm's capabilities in this evolving area. On the Sentinel team, dear colleague of mine, Julie Doran. Julie heads up our retirement plan advisory group here at Sentinel, and Julie is working closely with plan sponsors to implement fiduciary best practices and ensure prudent plan management, with the end goal of increasing plan effectiveness and positive retirement outcomes for participants. Also from Sentinel, Ben Healy. Ben is our COO, Head of Operations and Client Experience at Sentinel Benefits, and Ben works closely with Sentinel leadership and the Sentinel service teams to create and ensure an excellent service experience for our clients, our plan sponsors, and our plan participants. And certainly not least, but last, we're very happy to have Todd Larson join us. Todd is the head of technology at Sentinel Benefits. As Chief Information Officer and Chief Information Security Officer, he leads the information technology team overseeing the firm's software development, infrastructure, and information security and support systems and teams here at Sentinel. So panelists, thank you so much for being here today and joining us. As far as my opening remarks to everyone that's joined us today, a few months ago, we received recommendations from the United States Department of Labor with respect to cybersecurity practices regards retirement plans. Why is this so important? The DOL, as I think we all know, is one of the main regulatory bodies that oversees retirement plans. And therefore, it's important to heed their advice and their guidance. Secondly, assets in retirement plans are no longer in the billion-dollar range. They are in the multiple trillion-dollar range. Outside of people's homes, retirement assets are the second largest holdings that people have. Plan sponsors, a lot of folks on this phone are plan sponsors, and plan sponsors are responsible for those assets, which hinge on good governance and now good cyber practices. Failing to secure assets through lapses in cybersecurity puts the plan sponsor and participants at risk. In issuing these recommendations, the DOL is clearly saying that data, like assets, needs to be protected. Finally, the DOL gave their recommendations to plan sponsors, to plan service providers like record keepers, and to plan participants. And so we will look at each of these areas and those recommendations. To open it up for us, Jenny Holmes from Nixon Peabody. Jenny, if I could ask you, I know I've given a kind of a very high level overview, but could you level set for us and give us a good understanding of what the DOL recommendation said as it relates to sponsors, service providers, and participants?
Or thanks, Al. Just to give a little bit of context about where we've been over the past couple of years as it pertains to cybersecurity in the retirement space. About 2 or 3 years ago, we started seeing an increase in lawsuits pertaining to cybersecurity failures of benefit plans that resulted in benefit plan participants losing their entire account. And what we saw happening was sort of a not it game and finger pointing, where all parties involved were pointing to each other saying, not my fault. So the time for some sort of guidance, in my opinion, was long overdue. We were very excited to see the Department of Labor come out with these expectations for cybersecurity as they pertain to retirement plans. And I want to make it clear that these are expectations that the DOL sets out. This is not a law. These aren't regulations. These aren't anything that need to be followed to a T. These are just minimum guidelines, best practices, if you will. Now, Alan sort of explained it, but what the DOL did is they set out 3 different buckets of cybersecurity expectations. The first being for plan sponsors, the second being for service providers, and the third being for plan participants. For plan sponsors, the DOL is really looking for a written information security program that encompasses policies governing all aspects of cybersecurity, from limiting access to only those who have a need to see the information, password policies requiring strong passwords, managing vendors properly. So really running the whole spectrum of what we would expect a cybersecurity program to look like. In the second bucket with vendor, as it pertains to vendors, the DOL is really setting forth guidelines for what plan sponsors need to look for when they're selecting their vendors, and what sort of diligence they need to be doing before selecting those vendors, what cybersecurity protections need to be in place on that vendor's end, really making sure that we're not only doing the diligence before engaging, but then continuously monitoring our vendors to make sure that they are keeping up their end of the bargain. And then the last bucket, as it pertains to plan participants, sets forth best practices for online security for participants. It's changing passwords regularly, setting up multi-factor authentication if available, making sure you actually are logging on to your online retirement plan account. I think you would be shocked to know how few people actually do that. But so again, this places a lot of responsibility on the plan sponsor to make sure that those resources and that education is available for plan participants to look at it and to educate themselves. So, key takeaways from the DOL guidance is that we have 3 buckets, 3 pieces of this, and that it's expectations, not regulations. That being said, we have already, and Nick, if you could throw up the slide with the sample letter, we have already been seeing audit activity in this area. Typically, when the DOL sets forth expectations like this or guidelines, we could sort of have a long runway to get our plans in order before we would see audit activity. But we are already seeing audits come out that have questions relating to cybersecurity. So this is an audit that we received recently for a client at Nixon Peabody. And, it's among other topics that they are auditing, and it is not limited to cybersecurity, but we do see a heavy cybersecurity presence in these audit questions. So we wanted to share specific questions to show you the span of what the DOL is looking at. And really, it's taking a look at making sure that there are plans, policies, and procedures in place to protect the data, just like their guidelines are requesting. So I think that this really shows how seriously the DOL is taking this, and that plan sponsors need to be taking this very seriously as well.
Thanks, Jenny. One question I have for you is what I first read was some of these investigations were already in progress, and then the matter of cyber came up. I read something else recently that said no, that in fact cyber is becoming or has become the topic of investigations in and of itself. Is it both, or which one is it?
In my experience, it is both. The DOL dove right in as early as late spring, early summer with investigations that were ongoing. But now, as new investigations are commencing, we're seeing them right out the gate start with these cybersecurity type questions.
Thanks, Jenny. What I'd like to do next is turn our attention, as Jenny kind of teed it up, and turn our attention to plan sponsors. So, Julie, this one's for you. In your role, heading up our investment advisory practice, what are you seeing out there? What's the response been from the plan sponsors? You're working closely with sponsors. We're meeting with sponsors on a semi-annual, quarterly basis. What's that response look like from the plan sponsor with respect to these new recommendations?
Sure. Thanks, Al. So what we're seeing from the plan sponsor community as we're out there meeting with the fiduciaries who are charged with overseeing retirement plans is really twofold. I would say an initial reaction oftentimes is, thank you for the information. Isn't this the responsibility of our providers? So part of our role from an advisory perspective is really to educate our clients around the collective responsibility that's inherent in this guidance from the Department of Labor. So we're talking about a multi-pronged set of guidance, as Jenny mentioned, really directed at not only plan sponsors and fiduciaries, but plan providers and plan participants. So we have to educate them on the need for a more comprehensive program to address this guidance. The second reaction we've gotten fairly a common response is, depending upon the industry, if we're dealing with clients, for example, who are in the banking industry or financial services, this is something they're living and breathing in their business day to day. So they are much more aware of what a lot of this means, and they're ahead of the curve with respect to the programs that they maybe have in place internally. So it's been certainly a varied response from the plan sponsor community. I look at our role, as I mentioned, really to educate and then to advocate. So from the perspective of the advisor, what we're working with our clients to do currently is to make sure that they're fully aware of what the guidelines outline, what the expectations are, to advocate for them with their service providers to make sure that we're getting copies of any written responses from the providers, potentially setting up meetings with folks like Todd Larson, for example. On the Sentinel side, anyone who's playing that role of the Chief Information Security Officer, if the committee or the fiduciaries are really interested in doing a deeper dive, which we would recommend that they do in most cases, making sure that we're advocating for getting those meetings set up and so forth. So at this point, it's about putting the infrastructure in place to allow them to really do the due diligence that's necessary to make sure that they're meeting the expectations of the Department of Labor.
Thanks, Julie. Jenny, if I could ask you to kind of piggyback on what Julie said, what are you seeing in terms of your clients, your plan sponsors? Were plan sponsors already set up to kind of satisfy these new recommendations? Are these policies already in place? Are they started from square one? What are you seeing?
It's really a mixed bag. And I think that makes sense since plan sponsors can be, overseeing huge plans or smaller plans. They might be working for a company that's more sophisticated in the cybersecurity area than, a smaller company. So we're really all over the place when it happens. A lot of what we're seeing is that the organization, the entity itself has cybersecurity program or policies in place, but that those may not be extending, whether as written or in practice, to the actual retirement plan. So a lot of what we've been doing is working with plan sponsors and working with existing policies from the organization itself to make sure that that's covering the retirement plan and really leveraging, procedures and practices that are already in place at an organization level to work for the retirement plan as well. That's not to say that we haven't seen plan sponsors come to us with absolutely nothing in place, that we are starting from the ground and working our way up. And, that's fine. It's never too late to really dive into this. And, I think, as we've said, these are minimum expectations and not strict rules. So we can really find a way that cybersecurity practices can work for the plan while still committing ourselves to these expectations of the DOL.
I guess one question to pose to both of you, Julie and Jenny, is: do you think it makes sense to create some sort of cyber? We're very fond of our investment policies. Are we starting to talk about cyber policy statements? Is that a reaction?
Yeah, Alan, I would say, from our perspective, as Jenny alluded to, what we're trying to get plan sponsors really to understand is that they need to be documenting the processes that they have in place at their organization with respect to the retirement program. And, no better way in some ways to memorialize what your expectations are and your process are than a policy statement. Prudent process and documentation ultimately is what we use to guide how we advise plans and what they should be doing in order to keep themselves in the good graces of the Department of Labor and the IRS. And cybersecurity is certainly no exception to that. So a policy statement is one thing that we're considering. And, at Sentinel, we're working on a template that we could apply to the broader client base if that's something they're interested in doing. But really, it's about making sure they're identifying those processes and procedures, putting them down on paper, and that they're able to refer back to when those processes were actually put into place and the cadence with which they're followed. Because I think that's another important point here, is that this is not a one and done. This is going to become part of the regular oversight that the fiduciaries of the plan are tasked with. So we need to set up that infrastructure that I referenced earlier to make sure that we can create that consistent, repeatable process and document it as such.
And another one again for both of you. So, have you seen have service providers like record keepers and TPAs aggressively come out and sent you their cyber policies? In other words, are those folks coming forth with this, or is it something that you have to then ask for and then they start scrambling to produce it? Or what have you seen with respect to that?
So I've certainly reviewed many of the larger record keepers' white papers and their own statements of how they are responding to the DOL's guidelines, what they already have in place. And, I think they are taking a very active approach to what they're doing. I think in part, on one hand, to show, look at what we already do, we're great. On the other hand, to say, this is what we do and nobody else is you're not gonna change it. This is what we're doing. So while I think it's still really prudent for plan sponsors to review anything that they're getting from record keepers, TPAs, other vendors as it pertains to cybersecurity, I do think plan sponsors will be put in a bit of a sticky situation where with some of these larger vendors, there's not going to be a lot of negotiating power. But again, doing the diligence there and documenting that, like Julie said in her last little bit, the importance of documenting your practices. And I can't stress that enough. Making sure that everything is written out is so important here.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it. I'd like to spend the next couple of minutes talking about professional service providers, TPAs, record keepers, plan vendors, that community. Todd, this one's for you. In response to the DOL requirements, what are the first things that we Sentinel did on the IT side, or were there things that we had to do as a result of these recommendations, or were we already in good shape? What was our reaction?
Yeah, thanks, Al. I think the good news has been for us is we've been on a pretty steady path over the last few years. The landscape, not just the Department of Labor regulations, but other regulatory boards, federal government, state government, et cetera, have been moving us pretty steadily towards a path of getting our act together and keeping it together and making sure that we actually have a program that is in place and has been in place and It's not just focused specifically on the operations of technology and IT, which is certainly a huge part of security. But as we're seeing now, the Department of Labor is part of the business practice. It's part of what we sell at Sentinel is security. It's part of the peace of mind, part of the sales process. And I think you said it well, Al. Data is an asset to the firm. You kind of referenced that, and the protection of data is something that's sort of paramount. So we've been, like I said, on a steady path. We've been prepared for this. I think if there's anything that we're doing and we're trying to get better at in general, it's just identifying risk across the organization and getting very organized about seeing risk everywhere it lives in every part of the operation, whether it's a call center or whether it's a specific IT related risk or a other kind of financial risk. Aggregating all those risks and sort of making sure we have a good strategy to deal with it. And the other piece I would say is just sort of, maturing the program. I think that the DOL regulations, for me, although it's created a lot of work for me, I will admit, but it's all good. It's all good. I love the fact that it's front and center and people are paying attention to it more. And I think that that's only going to help us do a better job, and it's going to help our clients do a better job.
Thanks, Todd. Appreciate that. Let me also get Ben in here. Ben, our COO, from an operations standpoint. Again, how did we react? And if you want to comment, generally about the industry and others, feel free. But from an operations standpoint, Ben, what did you have to do anything, or what did we do? Or again, kind of along the same question that I had for Todd, were we already in good shape, or were there things that we had to do? And if so, what were they?
Yeah, certainly. So I think first and foremost, to Todd's point, I would certainly echo the support and appreciation for the DOL's guidance. We feel it closely aligns with many of the practices that Sentinel has been following for years, and we're excited about the sort of consistency and the formality that it's bringing to this important topic. As other providers have been, coming out with different white papers, we've provided ours as well. We're working on frameworks to share with clients. We just think it's really important, and this guidance has put it at the forefront, and we're certainly appreciative of that. In terms of our overall business operations, much of what we've been doing, as I mentioned, has been fitting in with the alignment of the DOL's guidance. So for us, it's really about reviewing and evaluating any gaps or anything we need to do to make, significantly more clear or easily shareable for our clients. So case in point, we've had a risk committee for years. They review our internal policies, controls, procedures for many of our different areas. We've been conducting vendor due diligence for years, handling internal employee training, doing penetration testing, those sorts of things. But what we really need to do is make sure that our policies and our procedures are ready to be shared with our clients. So if there's a request from auditors, if there's a request from a client for more information, that it's easily transferable, easily ready to be shared, partially, in self-interest for people like Todd, as he's been looped in to many of the requests that we've already had, but really just making it easy, scalable, so that these things can take place, efficiently. One other area that the DOL's guidance really started to talk about was service contract language, and making sure that we have clarity and alignment on those bullet points, including information security reporting, clear provisions of use and sharing information, notifications of breach, information on insurance, things of that nature. So we are reviewing our contracts. That process is already underway, and we'll have more information to share.
Thanks, Ben. Appreciate it. What I'd like to do now, spend a few minutes talking about participants. At the end of the day, it's really what retirement plans are all about. We are acting, or we should be acting, for the exclusive benefit of participants when we talk about a ERISA plan. So it's so critical to try to get the word out and guidance out and help out to participants. So Julie, we're talking to plan sponsors, but we at Sentinel and other advisors, we're talking to participants as well. So what should participants be doing? What are we saying to participants to do? to help them and safeguard their accounts and their assets and their data.
Sure. So, Jenny alluded to this a little bit in her upfront comments about there is this misperception out there amongst plan participants that if they never create their digital footprint, then they are safer. When in fact, that's the complete opposite of the truth. So we are definitely encouraging participants to go out, register their accounts online, set up their multi-factor authentication, essentially verify all of their personal data, keep that information current, and to the extent that they can continuously monitor their account on some sort of a periodic basis. That's really what we're encouraging folks to do. And some of the ways in which we're doing that currently is in those meetings with plan sponsors and fiduciaries, we're reviewing some reporting about, how many participants haven't registered their accounts online, who is not enabled for multi-factor authentication, who hasn't been periodically reviewing their online accounts, and really arming our clients with the data to go out to their employee population and make sure that they're reminding them of the importance of doing these things. And fortunately, when the Department of Labor came out with this guidance in April, they put together some pretty nice client-friendly fact sheets, including one directed specifically at plan participants. So one of our recommendations has been that our clients actually send that piece around to their employees as a nice reminder. It's a 2-page document, very well done with respect to here are some very easy tips and tricks to make sure that you're really safeguarding your personal information and your account. So that's been a recommendation of ours. We've also gone so far as to look at, the specifics on, this is the population that has not gone in and registered their account, and having folks maybe from our participant side of the equation reach out directly to those participants to let them know that they have a point of exposure there and they would want to consider taking some steps to further protect their assets and their information.
Thanks, Julie. Jenny, is there anything on that one that you want to add in terms of things that can be done or sponsors can do to help participants?
I think Julie covered it really well. Things that I've seen and have offering an annual cybersecurity training for plan participants. Separate and apart from any cybersecurity training you do for employees, having this really pertain to protecting yourself. So that's something we've seen. We've also seen online portals that have sort of one-page documents with best practices. It's so hard because retirement plans have all of these various points of access, and you really are relying on plan participants to protect themselves and protect the plan. So it's a really unique beast that plan sponsors are faced with.
I love that training that you mentioned. I think that's a great idea. In addition to Julie's advice, because it occurred to me, if you're not logging on, we can't exactly we may not be able to message people that have never logged on. So I think that's a great idea, great thought. Thanks, Jenny. Ben, from your standpoint, what safeguards do we have in place? And again, if you want to make it broader and talk about the industry and best practices, feel free. But from an ops standpoint, what are we doing?
Certainly. So I think first and foremost, Sentinel takes security and safeguarding participant assets extremely seriously. And we've invested tremendously in our software systems, time and energy in our procedures and our people to support this, principal belief for us. And we certainly follow a multi-layered approach to safeguarding those assets involving our system infrastructure, account security, transaction reviews, and education, both externally and internally. So we do security awareness training for our own people. We try and advise and educate clients and participants alike on the importance of this topic. One thing we have done related to some of the content that Julie was referring to, we've partnered and joined Stop Think Connect, which is a coalition set up by the National Cybersecurity Alliance that really provides educational content, campaigns, awareness. Any organization can sign up. So stopthinkconnect.org is a great resource to look at. And they provide great content, posters, flyers, email templates that you can share amongst your employees. And it's really about that general principle of let's share information about good, best practices for online account security, regardless of whether it's your retirement account or elsewhere. At Sentinel, some of the things we've done, we've provided plan sponsors specifically with reports and information around who's logged in, who hasn't logged in, stale dated accounts that we might deem to be quote unquote more risky if it's a high account balance that hasn't ever had a registration occur in that account. Those are things we'll work directly with plan sponsors and make sure that we're providing that information so that we can either do mailings, do calls, have them reach out. Ultimately, it's your employee at the end of the day, so you might have a better way of getting in touch with that individual than we would. For participants, we really take security in a few different channels. So for online account security, we've done things to secure our web by looking at IP address and geolocating, not allowing traffic from certain areas. We require every participant to use multi-factor authentication when they log in, unique user ID, password security questions. All of those things, would be unique to that end user. And we have very strict protocols around when any of that information would be changed and how it would go about being changed. Through our call center, we have a rigorous process for authenticating individuals. That's internal procedures as well as some top security vendors that we partner with for different ways to authenticate individuals. And I don't want to speak to all sort of the proprietary secret sauce that goes on behind the scenes, but we do have many layers of security through our call center to make sure that we're authenticating any individuals before we take action. Involving any transactions where assets could be deemed to be leaving the plan, so really retirement plan distributions or loans, we have a sophisticated proprietary system that we've built many layers upon, and that's internal reviews, anything that we deem to be risky based on our internal risk scoring system that gets flagged for our risk team to perform reviews on. We also do sort of random sampling following that same TSA method, if you will. We partner with other vendors to look at bank account verification information, if it's going to be a direct deposit type payment, and we do other things in terms of knowledge-based questionnaires to authenticate individuals. So we certainly view our security measures as thorough, layered security, and not just depending on one piece of information, just a user ID and password to get in, or just banking information to get money out, no reviews taking place. So we've certainly built quite an infrastructure to try and support our principal belief of safeguarding participant assets.
Thanks, Ben. That was great. Appreciate that. For the next few minutes, I'd like to ask the question on behalf of all of our attendees: what now? What to do now? If you're a plan sponsor, if you're a committee member, what to do now? And Jenny, I'm going to give you a first shot at this, and then I'd like to ask Eric to comment, and then Julie, and we'll get everyone's everyone's opinion on this. So what to do next? What to do now, Jenny?
I think the first thing that plan sponsors need to do is just take a deep breath and know that it's going to be okay. The guidelines do look like a lot. This looks like a lot of responsibility, and to be fair, it is. But it's definitely a doable to-do item, and I think most plan sponsors would find that they are already, at least in practice, doing many of the steps that the DOL is looking to see written down. What Eric and I have been advising our clients is to undertake sort of a gap analysis, we've been calling it, where you take a look at what policies, whether written or just in practice, are already in place. And we really compare that side by side with what the DOL is recommending, and we see where there are gaps. Do you have all of these practices, but none of them are written? Well, let's write them out in formal policies. Or maybe you have formal policies that touch on some of the DOL's recommendations, but not all of them. We can fill in those gaps there. So, the first step, I think, is really to just undertake this analysis of what you already have in place and how we can make that work for you. To the extent that we have to develop new policies, it's always important to then make sure we're implementing them, make sure that they're being reviewed regularly. I recommend looking at your cybersecurity plan at least annually, if not more, to make sure that it still, one, works for your company, or in your case here, works for the retirement plan, and two, that nothing needs to be changed per any new laws. The second thing we're really recommending plan sponsors do is take a look at their service providers, those third-party vendors, and making sure that we have some type of agreement in place pertaining to cybersecurity, whether that's those white papers that I discussed earlier from the larger service providers, making sure that we've done some type of diligence on those service providers, and that we have a written plan for how we're going to manage those service providers and do due diligence on new service providers before we engage them. So I think really undertaking sort of both of those steps, one, making sure that the internal, the house is in order, and then also looking externally when we're using those service providers to make sure that that relationship is taken care of as well. Both of those steps need to be done to really set yourself up for success here.
Great, thank you, Jenny. That was great overview. I want to bring Eric Pelly into the discussion as well. Eric, what can we add to what Jenny's good advice was? What occurs to me is it immediate response, a change in the complexion of the committee? What about bringing the board into this? Very often the committees are reporting to an arm of the board. Should we get the board involved, et cetera? Would you be so kind?
Well, first let me say it didn't escape my attention that you referred to me as an old friend about 40 minutes ago. So that didn't go unnoticed. But in answer to your question, I think you bring up some really excellent points. I mean, I'm looking at this from the standpoint of a fiduciary advisor, much like you would. And, we've been preaching for years the need to have good governance around your retirement plan and have, an engaged committee that's deliberating and looking at all aspects of your plan. Jenny talked about this, and she's absolutely right. I mean, it's an involved exercise to pull all these strands together and develop appropriate policies, but it's really an opportunity, and it's an important one to take because, your people and protecting your people's retirement plan is one of the most important things you could do as an organization. So from a committee perspective, I think this opens a new front in terms of what's expected of committees when minding their fiduciary responsibilities. If they weren't already, I think it's going to be extremely important to have some interface with someone in the organization who understands this policy and how it's being implemented and has some connectivity to the outside vendors, and at least a simple, I shouldn't say they have a simple understanding, is able to convey in simple terms to the rest of the committee how things are going, whether they feel confident that there is appropriate protection in place at all of these points of connection, both with the vendors as well as with the participants, so that the committee can ask questions, kick the tires, and come away with a good sense that, in addition to all the other things we do as a committee, looking out for the investments and looking out for the plan in general, that we have a high degree of confidence that, our risk of some sort of breach is minimal. And I think being able to come to that conclusion once a year by, again, interfacing with somebody, perhaps a permanent member of the committee whose role is to kind of monitor this, but certainly a guest once a year to talk about this and more frequently as needed. And then conveying that up to the board because, your committee exists and serves at the pleasure of your board. And so the board has an ongoing responsibility to make sure that the committee is doing its job. So, I think all those are excellent points, and it really does require, it's probably a good time, if nothing else, to sit down and look at your committee and decide, does this reflect the sort of responsibility we're supposed to be undertaking these days? And if not, reconstitute it. So I'll turn it back to you, my older friend.
Thanks, Eric. Appreciate it. Julie, any additional comments, in addition to what Eric, his sage advice and Jenny's wisdom?
Sure. So a couple of, more kind of tactical things that we're doing around what Jenny and Eric outlined would be, making sure that this is an agenda item on the committee's next meeting, right? Something as simple as formalizing it from that perspective. And, I talked earlier about educating and advocating on behalf of our clients. We're moving into the phase now where we need to start putting that framework or checklist into place so we can create some process documents around this. So that, again, as we're doing this year over year, there's some consistency in the reporting out as to what that due diligence effort looked like, and a review of those internal policies and procedures that we've talked about. So certainly putting those pieces into place. And then, again, if it's not recorded in the minutes, it didn't happen. So making sure that you have really solid minutes from the perspective that you're discussing this with your committees internally, any follow-ups, addendums to the minutes, and so forth. It's making sure that we're dotting the I's and crossing the T's as a partner to our clients to put all of these great practices into place.
Thanks. That was very appreciated, because it's very kind of, as you said, very tactical and kind of several action items. What to do now. Todd, I'll give you the last word on this, if you'd like. Any for you, what should plan sponsors, if you had, if the elevator was going down and you were with a plan sponsor, what would you say to them? What are the to-dos right now from an IT standpoint?
I'll pick up where Julie left off. I think, like, tactically speaking, and I'm going back to, we've seen a couple DOL letters come in, and our clients asking us for help, is having basically a standard response package. I think Ben mentioned it as well, and being able to sort of respond to that letter as it exists today, recognizing it might change in the future. But just being ready to work with our customers and our clients. As I referred to in the beginning, I literally see this as an opportunity to build bridges across what may have been a divide in the past. I think this topic is a way for us to work better and more with our customers, and it's a way for us to take hold of an opportunity to actually make data more secure, to make plan assets more secure. And it's a win-win the way I see it. And I was on a customer call just this week. I was talking to an IT person at one of our plan customers, and it's amazing where the conversation goes once you start. Like, what are you doing? I'm doing this. What are you doing? And it gets down into the level of detail where you start actually sort of getting ideas from each other about different ways that you can do things and ways that you can help each other. So, like I said, I love the conversation. I know it's going to continue because it has to. But I do, to Eric's point too, I think it's going to continue up the ladder, up the chain of command, and it's going to be something that strategically is going to be something that's definitely answerable to. But tactically, it's going to be part of the day-to-day operations of all business units.
Thanks, buddy. Appreciate that. Very good thoughts there. So, Ginny, last question for the panel. At least for me, and then I want to start opening up the chat and looking at the Q&As. We talked about cyber as a risk, or a potential risk and threat. So speaking of that, is there any way to ensure this? We hear a lot about cyber policies. Mm-hmm. Does it cover anything? I'm not trying to get my brain around how can you ensure this, if you will, ensure this risk.
Sure.
What's kind of the state of cyber policies?
I will say that cyber insurance has come a long way in recent years. 5 years ago, I think cyber policies maybe were not worth it. But at this point, they've really developed to meet the demands that I think are there. I would just, note a cautionary tale that as with every insurance, but I live with the cyber insurance world. There are exclusions, and we do need to be careful with what we're signing up for, making sure that we're really understanding that policy, and that it's actually going to work when we need it to, for what we need it to. So, with everything, just make sure that you take a close look at it, understand what it's actually protecting.
So kind of like check with your broker, and then probably give you a call.
Absolutely.
Okay. Thanks, Jenny. I'm gonna yield my time. I was gonna do a wrap up. I don't think I need to do a wrap up. I think the panel did a great wrap up. So let me go right to some Q&A and check the chat. And the first question that came up was, will Sentinel make its cybersecurity policy template available to all customers and when?
Sure. So I can speak to that a little, Alan.
Thanks, Julie.
So this is something that is a work in process currently, and we're designing it with that end customer in mind, such that we can make it available to anyone who's looking for a place to start. Certainly, I think Jenny and Eric would probably echo the fact that you need to customize it a bit to your organization, but we can provide a really good starting point for people. So I don't have a specific date when that's going to be available, but I would anticipate by the end of the year we would have that as something that would be available to our clients.
Thanks, Julie. And then there was a follow-up to that Q&A, and the question is that on the second page of your website? I'm going to have to go with that's a no.
Al, that was related to they put in a clarification question about the tips and tricks to safeguard participant accounts. So Nick had put into the overall chat for all attendees a link out to the DOL's website, which references as one of the linked documents there, a tips and tricks version. There's also things in our help center under the Stop Think Connect. There's some content out there that's also shareable. So please feel free to reach out to your Sentinel representative, and we can certainly help with any content needs.
Thanks, Ben. Appreciate it. And then the next one is who ultimately has the most most in quotes responsibility in the eyes of the DOL: the plan sponsor, the service provider, the plan participants. So I've got to turn that one over to counsel.
Yeah, let me weigh in. It's a trick question. The answer is always the plan sponsor. The plan sponsor is always responsible. Even if they're not responsible, the DOL will find them responsible. As a practical matter, you have to assume that even in our experience, when we've seen things that occur due to mistakes of the participants, if enough participants are harmed, the DOL will line it up as a problem for the plan sponsor. And you just have to approach it that way. Plan for the worst, hope for the best. That's certainly contractually how it's written too. Remember, the DOL doesn't really have significant direct oversight over service providers. They absolutely have direct oversight over the plan sponsors, and that's where they look to first to control everything.
I had a feeling, Counselor, you were going to say that. Sounds right to me. Will Sentinel review a cyber insurance policy for the plan sponsor? Guys, you want to take that one?
I would answer that with we are certainly happy to participate in that conversation. So I think to the extent that we would loop in other experienced professionals that have reviewed those historically, we may do that. But I think another set of eyes, and we'd like to participate in helping you navigate those waters. So the answer is certainly yes. Reach out to your plan representative. We can figure out the right parties to be involved to do that appropriately.
And then we've had Sentinel for many years. How do we check to see if we are protected with the guidelines of cybersecurity? Also, where would we get a hard copy of the DOL checklist? And Jenny, I believe that's the checklist I think you were referring to. So I guess first part is, how do we check to see if we're protected with respect to cyber guidelines? And how do we get that DOL checklist that I think Jenny referred to?
I saw you come off mute as well, Julie. If you want to go first, I'm happy to go second.
I was just going to make the point, and we're looking at the responses from providers across the record-keeping universe. So certainly, our partners on the Sentinel record-keeping side of the house, we're very familiar with the response there. And I can tell you that the way it's structured is directly in response to the Department of Labor's checklist, if you will, the 12 points. There are 12 responses from Sentinel, very similar format for a lot of the large record keepers. They've issued their responses, their written response to those to that list in such a format that you can kind of easily tick and tie back. So I think most providers have made it, a little bit more user friendly for you to do that due diligence on those specific points that they outline.
Thanks, guys.
And Al, if I can just weigh in additionally, and this kind of gets back to the question about who is ultimately responsible. There's the breach angle, which I think is sort of the mass breach, I should say, which is a catastrophic event that nobody wants. Then there's the, Ben Healy's account was stolen. And I think in the case of the Ben Healy's account is stolen for the plan sponsor, the ultimate liability, it comes down to who's approving the release of those funds. And if the plan sponsor is ultimately responsible for every dollar in and out of the plan, that's where I think it comes back to making sure we have strict review and approvals on those transactions. I know personally our operations team goes back to our plan consultants who go back to clients on many distribution requests just to make sure that, have you spoken to Ben Healy? This is $100,000 ACH. Let's just make sure you've actually talked to Ben and didn't assume that a transaction to the website is just Ben. Obviously, when we're doing that and going back to the plan sponsor, that's a layer of security that we have in there to protect both the participant, the sponsor, and ourselves. And I would just say that sponsors should make sure that you're thinking about what is your internal process for authenticating those kinds of transactions. I know many people will call and ask somebody for who was the HR person or what was the name of the office receptionist. There are things like that are non-public pieces of data that can help plan sponsors authenticate individuals if it's a terminated person who left a few years ago or something like that. So I think those are important considerations to make sure you yourself don't end up in a situation where you're liable for approving a money out transaction.
Thanks, Ben.
Yeah. Now there looks like there was one other just in the general chat about the top action items. I think Amy sort of outlined what they were, and I think that's exactly right. Review internal policies, make sure you have documentation on what your internal group is responsible for, how you're evaluating your vendors, how you're making buying decisions. So we'll certainly share our 12-point response to the cybersecurity guidance from the DOL, so you know exactly what Sentinel is doing. And I think when we also share that framework, that'll give you some good guidance in terms of next steps. But I do think you summarized it well in your question.
Yeah, no, I think it was a good overview.
And if I could just add real quick to that too, I think, Jenny mentioned, for example, some folks who feel maybe as though they are not where they need to be from a policies and procedures perspective internally. The other thing about this is this is evolving, right? So this guidance came out in April. We're already seeing Department of Labor investigations relative to cybersecurity. Providers are responding. Advisors are building those process documents necessary to really document. So this is an evolving process. So I think Amy outlined it well here in terms of those quick items you can start with right away. But there's definitely going to be more to come, I think, in terms of next steps, things like looking at contract language, outlining a process that you're going to follow annually, changing the composition of the committee potentially. So more to come for most people relative to this.
Yeah, and I think that's well said, Julie. And I would, I think in closing, I think it's almost back to basics, because as Eric said, this is really a governance issue, and so to make sure that there is a plan, oversight committee, to make sure that there are notes taken, to make sure that the committee meets regularly, the expansion of the committee, fiduciary training. It's almost a back to basics, and I think, like everyone on the panel said, I'm very optimistic, because when you have that sort of good foundation in place, you can tackle new things that come along. So with that, I really would like to thank the panel for their comments and their thoughtful advice and recommendations. That you guys were great, and I really also want to thank all of our attendees who took time away from their busy schedule to be with us.